It was 1 month ago today that 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was shot and killed in Florida. Some of the details of his killing are well known by now. Mr. Martin was unarmed. He was walking home from a convenience store carrying a bag of Skittles and an iced tea. The man who shot and killed Trayvon Martin on the street, George Zimmerman, has confessed to the shooting. He says he did it in self-defense. He has not been arrested or charged with any crime. This is the picture you've probably seen of Mr. Zimmerman. This is a more recent photo of him. From Washington, D.C. to Baltimore to Atlanta to Indianapolis to Iowa City, Iowa, and Detroit, Michigan, and San Francisco, people held rallies and marches and vigils in Trayvon Martin's memory today. The rally in San Francisco was called an emergency scream out because organizers said at this point a speak out was not enough. Speaking was not enough. It's time to yell. Over the weekend, people wore hoodies to church in support of Trayvon Martin, protesting the assertion that Mr. Martin may have looked suspicious because he was wearing a hooded sweatshirt. Last week, thousands of people gathered in Sanford, the Florida city where Trayvon Martin was killed. Today, big crowds gathered there again, this time marching to the Sanford Civic Center, where Trayvon Martin's parents spoke before the city council. This is his mother, Sabrina Fulton.
As a parent, you want some answers to your questions. As a parent. So I'm not asking for anything, any extra favors. I'm just asking for what you would ask for as a parent. I know I cannot bring my baby back, but I'm sure going to make changes so that this does not happen to another family.
And with the backdrop of that hearing and the protests in Sanford and across the country, anonymous law enforcement authorities have leaked to the media the shooter George Zimmerman's side of the story. They leaked it to the Orlando Sentinel newspaper. According to these anonymous law enforcement sources or a specific source, Mr. Zimmerman says he had turned around and was walking back to his SUV when Trayvon Martin approached him from behind. The two exchanged words, and then Trayvon punched him in the nose, sending him to the ground and began beating him. Mr. Zimmerman told police he shot the teenager in self-defense. Remember, Mr. Zimmerman is 28 years old. He was carrying a gun, and he initiated the encounter with this teenager after following him around the neighborhood. Trayvon Martin was totally unarmed. There were more anonymous releases of records today about Trayvon Martin's suspensions from school, once for writing the letters WTF on a locker. His mother responded to those reports by saying, quote, "They killed my son, and now they are trying to kill his reputation." A conservative website today published what they said were tweets from Trayvon Martin's Twitter account, as if that might shed light on whether or not he should have been shot. The Martin family's lawyer, Benjamin Crump, spoke today before the Sanford City Council.
Who was the officer who made a decision, for whatever reason, to not do a background check on George Zimmerman, who had just shot and killed Trayvon Benjamin Martin, but yet saw fit to do a background check on this dead child on the ground? Can't you understand that none of this would be going on if they simply would have treated George Zimmerman like they would have treated Trayvon Martin?
With the furor over the case showing no signs of dying down, quite the contrary, with no further indication at this time that there will be an arrest in the case, the interwoven strands here are outrage over the racial profiling that appears to have led to the shooting in the first place, Trayvon Martin seeming suspicious because of his race, according to the shooter, the implicit excusing of violence against black men because of the racial profiling of black men as dangerous, the gun law that has been cited as the reason to not arrest the shooter in this case, the so-called stand your ground law, even though chasing someone down on the street because they look suspicious to you is nobody's idea of standing your ground. New York Senator Chuck Schumer is calling for a nationwide review of so-called stand your ground laws, which Florida pioneered, but which exist now in more than 20 states. Senator Schumer is asking the Department of Justice to investigate whether these laws may be creating more violence and whether potential murder cases are going unprosecuted because these laws make it harder to bring those cases in court. Joining us now is Senator Charles Schumer, the senior senator from New York and a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Schumer, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's nice to have you with us.
Good evening.
You have asked the Attorney General Eric Holder to investigate these stand your ground laws. You've been calling them a shoot first, ask questions later type of law. Why do you think the Justice Department federally should look into this?
Well, these laws, which have all been passed very recently, change the common law and the law we've always observed, the law I was taught in law school 30 years ago, which is when you're outside of your home and you're faced with a very troubling situation, you don't shoot, you try to avoid doing that and try to invoke law enforcement whenever possible. The stand your ground law seems to say that if you imagine that you might be in physical danger, you can shoot. And the Orlando Sentinel, the local paper in the Sanford area, studied 13 instances where stand your ground was invoked and a police officer, a person invoked that law. In all but one of the cases, the person who was shot or shot at did not have any weapon at all. Now, 6 people were killed and 4 people were injured. So clearly something is amiss here. And you know, I have a lot of faith in our justice departments, in our sheriffs and in our police. They're trained. They do a lot better in most situations, in almost all situations, than a civilian. For instance, had Mr. Zimmerman actually listened to the police when he called because he saw Trayvon, they told him not to pursue him and to let the police come and pursue him. Had Zimmerman listened, things would be a lot better today than they were then. So we need a broad investigation for 2 reasons. One, this law, which is now, as you said, Rachel, in 20 states, could well be causing more violence than it prevents. And second, it seems to be preventing the law enforcement from being able to prosecute cases that would otherwise be actionable. And those are pretty serious things. And so I think we need a quick and thorough investigation of how this law is working. And maybe the states on their own, when they saw that, would repeal them. Maybe it'll require some federal action. That remains to be seen. But we certainly should examine these laws, which have been passed sort of in a rushed way by more than 20 states.
One of the things that's interwoven with concern over these, as you say, relatively recent stand your ground gun laws, or stand your ground, I guess, anti-self-defense laws in these states, is the concern about how race factors into this. You identified the idea, the core idea of these laws is that you have to imagine you might be in danger. And imagination is inflected by all sorts of things, including prejudice. It happens whether or not we think of ourselves as racist people or bigoted people. When we imagine threats, we imagine them coming from all sorts of places that aren't a legally actionable course. Do you think that the concerns, the long-standing concerns about racially biased policing, about racially selective prosecution, can be addressed at the same time? I realize the gun laws are novel, but those concerns about race and policing and prosecution are old.
Well, you know, my call is for an investigation of this law, which is new. We do have a civil rights division, which, of course, has investigated cases where race may well be at issue over and over and over again. But I would tell you this, I'm dubious of these laws which encourage vigilantism, even if there weren't a racial component involved. The idea that anyone, when they think that they're in serious physical harm, that they're going to be punched, that they then should take out a gun and shoot the person who they think might be punching them is really very, very troublesome. And we ought to get to the bottom of it before these laws before they spread and before they come too ingrained in our culture. As I said, it seems to encourage vigilantism when the right thing to do is rely on law enforcement.
Senator Charles Schumer of New York, thank you very much for your time tonight, sir. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel. Good to talk to you.
Thanks.